The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. We're going to be starting our webinar here in just a moment. We want to go ahead and take a quick poll here to find out a little bit why you're tuning in today and what your background is. So I'm going to be putting up a couple of questions that will pop up on your screen. If you don't mind, please go ahead and answer as best as you can. I'll leave each question up for about 30 seconds or so. So we're going to go ahead and get the webinar started probably in about 5 minutes, give everybody enough time to log in and deal with any technical difficulties that almost always end up happening. So we're putting up the first question now, and we will, like I said, get started in about 5 minutes. So while we're waiting for everybody to join and while you're answering these questions, we can go ahead and introduce ourselves and maybe tell you a little bit about the GoToWebinar platform that we're using. It's got some features that we're going to be using throughout the webinar. My name is Nathan Darris. I'm with the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs. I am the Fair Housing Research Specialist. With us today, we also have Marilyn Diaz and Elena Rodriguez with the Texas Workforce Commission, as well as Kate Trace, also with TDHCA. Marilyn, did you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Marilyn Diaz. I am, right now, I'm kind of the assistant for outreach, compliance, and resolutions at Texas Workforce Commission Civil Rights Division. And I'm doing a lot of the fair housing training webinars and EEO training webinars. I also assist with our mediation team and our Elena, who's our monitor, who does their reviews of agencies around the state of Texas. So that's a little bit about me. Elena, do you want to say anything?
Thank you for that. Good morning, everyone. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and I'm the Civil Rights Division Outreach, Compliance, and Resolution Manager. Ms. Diaz has been filling in enormously for our division and assisting with training and conciliation and or mediation agreements, and I want to thank her very much for that. And I thank you for being here today, and I look forward to working with you and providing assistance as needed.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and put up our third question now, and that should be our last one. And we're going to go ahead and get started in probably the next couple of minutes here. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started now. A little bit of house cleaning before we get to the meat of the presentation. Right now we have everybody muted, so we won't be able to hear you if you speak, even if you have your microphone turned on. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, go ahead and use the questions panel in the GoToWebinar software. You can ask us there whatever your question is, and we can either answer you privately, we can share that answer with everybody else, or if it is a particularly pertinent question, we may get to it throughout the course of the webinar itself and answer it out loud. Rest assured, though, that if we cannot answer your question today, we will be contacting you individually to answer your question. We may just need to get a little bit more information from you so that we can do a little bit of research to make sure that we get you the fullest answer that we can. We may also open up things throughout for people who want to ask their questions vocally. If we do that and we have time for that, we will want to use the raise your hand button. This will let us know that you want to talk, and we can unmute you and call on you. Finally, while we're taking your questions at the end of the webinar, we're going to put some questions up for you to answer, just like we did at the beginning. Just answer them as best as you can. It isn't a test. You're not going to fail anything. We just want to get a feel for where the webinar could be better, where it's working. So on that note, we will not be giving out certificates for attending this webinar. So it's unlikely you'll be able to use it for continuing education credits. But even if that's why you're here, we do want to encourage you to stick around. This information is all still very new and very, very useful. You will notice that we do have closed captioning at the bottom of the screen. So even if you aren't able to listen in, you won't be missing any of the content if you follow along with the video only. The video of this webinar, all the handouts, and a transcript of this webinar will also be available soon on TDHCA's Fair Housing Presentations website under the training section. There you'll also be able to find the other webinars we've done this month as well as in past years. We will send you an email as soon as the webinar is available on the website. So now that we've gotten through the administrative stuff, let's get on to HUD's guidance on assistance animals. At least anecdotally, TDHCA, Texas Workforce Commission, and HUD have noticed that there has been a lot of confusion around the topic of assistance animals, service animals, and emotional support animals. If you're one of those people who wasn't clear on it, don't feel bad. You're not alone. HUD estimates that almost 60% of all of their fair housing complaints had to do with reasonable accommodations and accessibility, and indications are that an increasing number of those were specific to assistance animals. In the state of Texas 2019 analysis of impediments, TDHCA analyzed complaints in Texas and found a similar pattern. Almost 1 in 3 housing complaints filed in Texas mentioned denial of reasonable accommodations as one of the issues. In fact, this confusion was so widespread that HUD recently updated guidance on the topic of assistance animals as a reasonable accommodation. That guidance is going to make up the bulk of this webinar. We split this into 2 major areas, just like the HUD guidance did. First, we'll talk about assessing a person's request for an assistance animal, and then second, we'll talk about how to document the need for an assistance animal. The first part of this is going to be especially useful for property managers, owners, and residents. The second part will be very helpful for tenants and tenant representatives or advocates. So how should a property go about assessing a request for an assistance animal? Well, let's start off with a different question. Which of these groups of animals are specifically allowed to be an assistance animal? So I'm going to go ahead and put that poll up here for just a second. Okay, it looks like about half of you have responded. 70% of you say that any type of animal can be an assistance animal. That is the correct answer. And we'll get into the details of why that's true. But everybody here has probably heard some story about an emotional support peacock, a monkey, an aardvark, or a gerbil. And in fact, some of those examples are taken straight out of news stories. The peacock, for instance, was barred from being allowed on a plane. And if a peacock can't be an emotional support animal on a plane, can it be an emotional support animal in your home? So the answer is D, obviously. In theory, any animal could be considered an assistance animal under the Fair Housing Act. And right now, I'm sure at least a handful of you are thinking to yourselves, well, that's it. It's going to be the Wild West on my property. But we do want you to know it's going to be okay. You won't be overrun by the kangaroos and ocelots and elephants and peacocks. So you might notice that throughout this webinar, there are a couple of bolded terms. We've bolded assistance animal, service animal, and emotional support animal. These words are bolded because this is where a lot of the confusion occurs. People tend to use these terms interchangeably, and the next few slides should help to clear this up. So what is an assistance animal? An assistance animal is an animal that does work, performs tasks, assists or provides therapeutic emotional support, and is not just a pet. There are two basic types of assistance animals. There are service animals and other animals that do those things that we just said. Not a very helpful grouping. So let's dig a little bit deeper. Most importantly, an assistance animal is not a pet. They should not be treated by a pet as a pet by housing providers. This means that you can't charge your pet fees, pet deposits, or pet rent for an assistance animal. This also means that your breed and size restrictions, such as no pit bulls or only dogs under 45 pounds, do not apply to assistance animals. And this last part is also very important. Not all assistance animals are service animals, but all service animals are assistance animals. While HUD does spend some time discussing service animals specifically, I found it's a bit easier to use the term assistance animal so that there is no confusion here. This diagram is a good way to think about service animals and emotional support animals and how they relate to assistance animals. If an animal is a service animal, it's an assistance animal. If an animal is an emotional support animal, it is an assistance animal. If the animal is an assistance animal, it is not a pet. For the purposes of the Fair Housing Act, it makes sense to disregard the terms service and emotional support and focus on assistance animals. So why the distinction? There are a couple different laws at work here. The ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, covers public accommodations and only requires that service animals be allowed in public accommodations or in state and local government programs, activities, or services. People often assume that this means the ADA applies to privately owned apartment complexes or properties because they have public or common areas. However, the Fair Housing Act requires reasonable accommodations to be made to allow assistance animals in dwelling units, such as apartment units or any common area that is available to tenants of the apartment complex. This means that assistance animals, the more inclusive definition, must be allowed, and not just in the apartment unit of the tenant, but the mailroom, office, common rooms, and so on. So while the ADA may apply to some areas of the apartment complex, the Fair Housing Act applies to nearly all parts of an apartment complex and places greater restrictions on the property as far as what they must allow. So what is a reasonable accommodation? It's a change, alteration, or an adjustment to a rule, policy, procedure, service, or practice that may be necessary for a person with a disability to use and enjoy a dwelling and its public and common use spaces. It does not have to be written. There are no magic words. A person doesn't need to say reasonable accommodation. If they ask you to change a rule and mention that they have a disability, or even describe a condition that a reasonable person would recognize as a disability, such as I have trouble seeing or I can't hear well, that is enough to constitute a request for a reasonable accommodation. At this point, you should jump into the following flowcharts to help you determine what to do next. The best practice is to keep a copy of any and all requests that you receive and to keep that documentation provided along with or in response to the request. Do not share that information with others unless the person that you're sharing it with is necessary to processing the reasonable accommodation request. So we've already used the terms assistance animal and service animal so far. Let's clarify what we mean by those terms specifically. The ADA has a specific definition of a service animal. Most importantly, the service animal can only be a dog, and it must be trained to do work or perform tasks. There is one exception to this definition. The Department of Justice has determined that in very specific circumstances that are unlikely to ever apply to a typical multifamily apartment complex, miniature horses can also be considered a service animal. Additionally, and we'll cover this later, as a barnyard animal, miniature horses are not considered to be commonly kept animals. We'll cover that a little bit later in more detail. So, the only reason why, for the purposes of the Fair Housing Act, you would need to consider whether an assistance animal is a service animal is that there are specific types of questions that are allowed if the animal is a service animal. So this chart's going to take you through that process step by step. But the simplest way to think of this is in the form of a few easy questions. First, is the animal a dog? And second, is the animal obviously performing work or a task for an individual with a disability? If you answer yes to both of those, stop, do not pass go, do not collect $200, do not ask any more questions. The dog is a service animal, and further inquiry is not only not required, but is inappropriate. What does readily apparent mean? Well, in the words of Justice Potter Stewart, you know it when you see it, but here are some examples. So, if you answered yes, it's a dog, but no, it's not obviously performing a task for a person with a disability, then you may ask essentially two questions. Is the animal required because of the disability, and what work or task has the animal been trained to perform? So what does readily apparent mean? We'll go back to that. Some examples of what readily apparent might be is a dog that's guiding an individual who has low vision or is blind, or a dog pulling a wheelchair or guiding an individual in a wheelchair, or a dog providing assistance with stability or balance to an individual with an observable mobility disability. So, if the animal is required because of a disability, but the disability is not readily apparent, what can you ask? If the animal is required because of the disability and the individual identifies at least one action that the dog is trained to take, which is helpful to the disability other than emotional support, then you can consider it a service dog, and you should grant the reasonable accommodation. But wait, even if you answered no to any or all of these questions, and the disability is not readily apparent, and the work that the animal does is not readily apparent, it doesn't mean that the animal isn't another type of assistance animal. Doesn't mean that we immediately say no to the reasonable accommodation. Fortunately, the process for determining whether or not to approve an assistance animal is basically the same as for a service animal. First, does the requester have a readily apparent impairment or disability, or did you already know of a requester's disability? Second, does the requester have information that reasonably supports that the animal performs work or tasks, provides assistance, or provides therapeutic emotional support with respect to the disability? If the answer is yes to both of those, then great. We're going to move on to the next step, and that'll be on the next slide. If the disability is not already known or readily apparent, then did the requester provide information that reasonably supports that the requester has a disability? If so, and they have the information supporting the need for the assistance animal as discussed already, then we'll move on to the next step as well. If not, the housing provider is not required to grant the reasonable accommodation. but you can't expect that every requester is going to have all of their assistance ducks in a row when they come to you. You do need to give them reasonable opportunity to provide the necessary information. A good rule of thumb is that if you haven't asked them for the information and given them a chance to bring it to you, you probably can't deny the request. So while it is not required, HUD and TDHCA both encourage you to let the requester know about the HUD guidance document that was released in January, and particularly the portion about documenting need, which is what we're going to cover in the second part of this webinar. That guidance document is available as one of the handouts in the GoToWebinar software, and it will be available on the TDHCA website when we post the webinar materials. So what kind of information would reasonably establish that an individual has a disability? When in doubt, government documents are always an acceptable source. If it's a federal, state, or local government that provides disability benefits or services to the requester, that's good enough to establish that the disability exists. But that doesn't mean that's the only source. Receiving Social Security disability income, Medicare, or supplemental security income while under 65 also establishes a disability, as do veterans' disability services or benefits. If the person has a voucher for a housing program or receives housing assistance because of a disability, count it. If a healthcare professional confirms the individual has a disability, also count it. Note this does not just mean doctors. It also does not mean only the primary care physician. Just because an individual doesn't qualify as having a disability for a benefit or program, like the first few, does not mean that they don't have a disability as defined by federal law. So the Department of Justice has identified certain impairments or conditions that almost always will be considered a disability. Note that this list is not exclusive and just because a condition is not listed here doesn't mean that the condition is not considered a disability. Individuals with disabilities that are not observable may also voluntarily provide details about their disability. Sometimes these details are more than what you need to make a decision on accommodation requests, but this information, when provided, should be considered. So, just because a disability isn't obvious or readily apparent doesn't mean it doesn't exist or isn't real. Diabetes is an excellent example of this. One of the possible side effects of diabetes is called diabetic neuropathy, which is the dulling of the sensation of the extremities. This can make it difficult or impossible to walk, open jars, or other daily activities. However, it's not necessarily readily apparent when an individual is diabetic or experiences diabetic neuropathy. So even though the disability might not be clear to the housing provider, the provider is not entitled to know the individual's diagnosis, just that the individual has a disability. So this is particularly important because certain impairments, especially impairments that form the basis for a request for an emotional support animal, may not be observable, probably are not observable. So in those instances, a housing provider can request information regarding both the existence of the disability and the disability-related need for the animal, but that does not mean you get to know or need to know or may ask for the individual's specific diagnosis. So one of the biggest concerns that TDHCA has heard anecdotally is that housing providers have seen all those sites that advertise that they'll make your dog or cat or weasel a certified emotional support animal for a nominal fee. Elena and Marilyn, I don't know if you all have seen this in the same way, but we get a lot of people talking about, they come in with just this little certificate that says it's emotional support animal. Do you guys have anything that you wanted to add to that part?
Yes, we've gotten a variety of TWC Civil Rights Division of complaints and requests for assistance animals. We've seen chickens, we've seen goldfish, we've seen it's the whole gambit. The biggest thing that we assist our housing providers with, as well as our tenants across the state, is what can be asked and what can't be asked.
Okay, great. So the biggest thing to note here is that documentation from the internet from a company that certifies emotional support animals, that documentation alone is not sufficient to establish that the requester has a disability or to establish that disability-related need for the animal. So remember, if the disability is not readily observable or apparent, then it's not acceptable. Sorry, if the disability is not observable, then it is acceptable to request documentation to reasonably indicate that the requester has a disability and the disability-related need for that animal. Having a certificate saying that an animal is an emotional support animal or an assistance animal only indicates that the requester spent money on a certificate. It isn't even proof that the animal isn't really an assistance animal. The requester may have legitimately thought that the assistance animals had to be certified. They don't. So these certificates don't prove anything either way. If one of your tenants comes to you and says, "Hey, I've got this certificate," that doesn't mean that the animal isn't necessarily actually an assistance animal. It just means that they got duped on the internet, most likely. Just like with determining whether the requester has a disability, a healthcare professional is one of the primary sources for supporting information on the disability-related need for an assistance animal. However, if the disability-related need are obvious or already known, don't ask for additional information. So for example, if you have a requester who's already asked for grab bars in the shower and you installed them, and they come down in their wheelchair to the leasing office every day to say hi, when they email a request to allow an assistance dog to help them with mobility, you don't need to ask for any new information. You already have all the information that you would need to make that determination. Disability is obvious. It's previously known that the individual has mobility needs, and the request says that the dog is to help with mobility. The disability, the need, and the nexus between the assistance animal and the need is established. But what if it's not a dog? What if it's not even a cat? What about that peacock? There's one easy question you can ask yourself in this situation. Is the animal that the individual is requesting commonly kept in households? So if the animal is commonly kept in households, you don't need to ask for more information about the animal or the work or tasks or therapeutic support it provides. Dogs, easy. Cats, normal. Fish, normal. Turtles, absolutely. Rodents, personally gross, but normal. Even small birds like parakeets and finches. While not expressly mentioned in the guidance, ferrets, which are not rodents, are small domesticated animals that are traditionally kept in the home for pleasure. This means they would also be considered to be commonly kept. Once you get outside that group, you start to fall into barnyard or unique animals. If the requester is asking for a snake, monkey, peacock, Texas horned lizard, an elephant, then the requester has the substantial burden of demonstrating the disability-related need for that specific type of animal. Not only that, but they need to demonstrate that the same benefits could not be achieved by a different, commonly kept household animal. If the requester doesn't have that documentation up front, don't deny the request right away. You still need to give them a reasonable opportunity to obtain that information. But what this all boils down to is, don't worry. You will most likely never have an emotional support peacock in your complex. So some things to think about here in general. What about dangerous dog breeds? Well, breeds of dogs are not inherently dangerous, but specific dogs might have a history of dangerous behavior that would pose a direct threat to the health and safety of others. Does that mean you can say no to all pit bulls? No. But you can say no to that one Chihuahua that has a history of biting. When a requester submits their reasonable accommodation request for an assistance animal, HUD Guidance indicates that you should be able to handle the response within 10 days. In many cases, even 10 days might be too long or not enough time. If the need and the disability are obvious and the animal is a service dog, it should probably not take 10 days. In unique circumstances, it might take a little longer than 10 days, though. Homeowners Association or HOA rules are not exempt from reasonable accommodations. Same with zoning laws, land use laws, or co-op rules. If your HOA prohibits certain dog breeds, that restriction does not apply to assistance animals. Same with local ordinances. A city with a breed restriction, those restrictions don't apply to assistance animals either. A housing provider may not charge for processing or granting a reasonable accommodation. The requester may be responsible for paying, however, for any structural modifications, but there may not be any fee, charge, deposit, or surcharge for the reasonable accommodation itself. And since in the case of assistance animals, it's unlikely there are structural modifications, there should be no fees, charges, or deposits or surcharges for assistance animals. Housing providers may, however, charge for damages caused by assistance animals if they usually charge for damage caused by tenants. This can include deductions from security deposits if all tenants have to put down a deposit, obviously. If a housing provider only charges pet deposits but no security deposits, there would be no deposit for an assistance animal in that case. Housing providers are not responsible for taking care of an assistance animal. That responsibility falls on the individual with the assistance animal. This may mean that friends, family, or service providers that they contract with aid in taking care of the animal, but it does not mean the housing provider must care for the animal. Even if you're denying a reasonable accommodation request for any reason, a housing provider should try to engage in an interactive process with the requester to try to identify alternative accommodations that could be made. Just because they ask for something that you cannot say yes to, you should still come together and try to figure out something that works for both of you. Housing providers also may not require specific types of evidence or forms to be used when requesting information from a requester, and they should never, ever ask or require that a requester disclose their diagnosis. The requester may offer that information voluntarily. That's fine. And if they do, it should be considered as informative and related to the request. But it should never be shared with anybody who is not responsible for making a determination of whether to accept or deny a request. So this is probably going to be a good place to take a quick minute to look over some questions if any questions have come in. And while we look over what you've sent in to us, we can put up a couple more questions in the polls, although I don't know that I don't have any more polls for that. Kate, did we have any questions?
Sure, yeah, Nathan, this is Kate. Hi, everyone. This is Kate Trace. I'm the manager for Fair Housing at TDHCA. We do have a couple of questions that have come in that I think now might be a good chance to answer. The first one is, are assistance animals allowed to be considered an occupant of the rental unit? So how would you document the assistance animal in the unit?
So I don't know if you, Elena, or Marilyn want to chime in. I have a response unless you guys want to, unless you all have a better answer.
Go ahead and kick us off.
Okay, yeah. I mean, an assistance animal is not an occupant, right? Nor would a pet be an occupant. What you're saying is that you normally require, I'm guessing, what I'm hearing is that you normally require, any pets to be listed on a lease. So in the case of an assistance animal, while it would not be listed as a pet, in the tenant's file, you would want to attach any documents that you had regarding to their request for the assistance animal. And that would be probably enough to determine, enough information to say, yes, there's an assistance animal in the unit.
Okay, thank you for that. We've got a couple more questions we could probably take now. I have a couple of questions about the number of assistance animals or emotional support animals you can have per, depending on the household composition. So if there's
3 folks living in the unit, is there a limit on the number of animals that you could have for an assistance animal?
Elena and Marilyn?
You're doing great so far. Keep going.
You got it. Okay. So the answer is yes and no. There is no hard limit in terms of the number of assistance animals per person or per square foot. That said, an individual who has documentation of a disability and a need for, say, one assistance dog, that's one dog. Any animals in that unit over and above that one dog are pets, and so whatever your pet rules are would then take over. But there are cases there where an individual may need several different types of assistance animals who perform different tasks. So even in an individual who lives by themselves, it's one person in a 1-bedroom apartment, they may need 3 different animals for doing 3 different things. An example probably, and I think I cover this later, but I think this is a good time for this example. You have an individual who has 2 different disabilities. 1, they have epilepsy, and 2, they have a mobility disability. They may need a dog, and there are dogs that are trained to either alert an individual before they have an epileptic seizure, or to basically burrow underneath an individual who's having a seizure in order to protect them from hitting their head or damaging themselves. But that dog probably can't help them, say, reach things out of a cabinet or open a jar of peanut butter. They may have a need for an assistance monkey, which is an example. That's the example we'll talk about later. Monkeys have opposable thumbs and can open jars. So they may need multiple assistance animals in that case. So while there's no hard limit on it, it is limited by the number of animals that the person has a need for, that is a documented or obvious need for.
Okay, thank you, Nathan. Let's do one more, and then we can probably jump back into the presentation. There's some good questions streaming in now. This one, there's a couple of questions in here about vaccinations. Can the property require that the animals be vaccinated, or can they request that the vaccination papers?
So you can request that an animal is vaccinated if the municipality or state, right? If an animal would be required to be vaccinated anyway, then yes, you can require that assistance animal to be vaccinated. So in some cases, right, some cities require dogs to be vaccinated against, say, rabies. You can require that any assistance dog be vaccinated for rabies. You can't request anything over and above that. You can't say, well, on top of your rabies vaccine, I need you to have a vaccine for, name some other dog disease that your city doesn't require. Can you request the vaccine information? Absolutely, yes. That's a health and safety issue. You absolutely may request to see or request documentation that the animal is properly vaccinated up to whatever the governing standards are for where you are.
To add to that, I want to make it very clear that if that is your method, that you want to make sure your policies and procedures reflect that for your organization, and that it is applied across the board, and you don't want to apply it discriminately to your tenants or applicants. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a great addition, right? If you don't require tenants who have pets to have that documentation, to have vaccinations, or show that they have vaccinations, don't require it of people who have assistance animals, because that would not, and it needs to be applied evenly. Absolutely.
Because by creating that gap, what happens is then you put yourself in a legal situation where it becomes the legal discriminatory theory of disparate treatment. So you want to avoid this litigation altogether and perception.
Excuse me. Sorry. All right. And so that sounds like all the questions we're going to get to right now. So we're going to jump into the second part of the HUD guidance, which is documenting an individual's need for an assistance animal. So at the heart of any reasonable accommodation request, there are three major things that you need to establish in order to qualify for a reasonable accommodation, or in order for a request to be a reasonable accommodation request. One, you need to have a disability and demonstrate it to the housing provider. Two, you need to tell the housing provider exactly what accommodation you need, what rule or procedure you're seeking a change or exception to. In the case of an assistance animal, you're usually requesting an exception to the housing provider's pet policy. Three, you need to establish that you have a need for the change in policy because of your disability. This is called the disability-related need. Just having a disability does not necessarily mean that you have a disability-related need for what you're asking for. As an example, a requester may have epileptic seizures. The requester asks for an accommodation allowing an emotional support pig. In this case, there's no connection between the disability and the request. That is, there's no disability-related need for the pig. However, there may be a disability-related need for an assistance animal such as a dog that is trained to get underneath an individual's head during a seizure to protect against brain damage. Sometimes these three things are readily apparent. And if a request, so for example, if a requester uses a cane for the blind and requests an accommodation for a dog to help guide them, this individual has already established the existence of the disability, identified the needed accommodation, and connected the accommodation to a disability-related need. So this page is probably going to feel like it's a lot, but it really isn't that much if you think about it this way. The page is telling us what HUD recommends. These are best practices. So following these steps to the letter will help you get a faster response and make it less likely that your request is denied incorrectly or mistakenly. So what does HUD recommend? When you're speaking to your healthcare professional or provider, ask them for a letter or prescription that includes your name, stating that they treat you for a disability. They don't need to say what the disability is, and what kind of animal the accommodation will be for. This covers the first two criteria from the last slide, documenting that you have a disability and identifying the accommodation that you need. To cover the third and final criterion, HUD recommends that healthcare professionals' assessment or letter or prescription includes the reason why the animal is needed as it relates to the requester's impairment. What kind of work or support or assistance does the animal provide, and how does it help alleviate the impairment? You do not need to disclose your diagnosis. However, if you do, a housing provider should never share that or any other information from your request with anybody else unless that person is needed to evaluate the request. So, what if I really do need that peacock or an anteater or a monkey? In this case, you're going to have to provide a little more documentation. HUD recommends that your documentation includes the last time your healthcare professional consulted with you, identifying the unique circumstances that justify the need for that particular animal, and if the healthcare professional has reliable information about this specific animal, or whether they specifically recommend that animal or type of animal. So this probably seems like a lot. This next slide should help, even though it looks like a lot more information. If you take this bulleted list with you to your healthcare provider and make sure that they answer each of these items, this will cover any reasonable accommodation request for any type of assistance animal. Remember, this is your healthcare provider, so let them know what you need so that they can give you the answers you need so you can be in your home with your assistance animal as quickly as possible and with the least amount of difficulty possible. One, get your healthcare provider to write a statement that says your name, the date they last consulted with you, stating that they're responsible for your care in relation to an impairment that limits at least one major life activity, what the accommodation is that's needed, what type of animal the accommodation is for, the disability-related need for the animal. Does it perform a task, work, or therapeutic emotional support that alleviates a symptom or effect of the disability or impairment? Any unique circumstances justifying the need for the particular animal, if it's unique, and any information that explains that the healthcare professional has reliable information about this unique animal and that they specifically recommend that unique type of animal to you. Taking this slide in with you to your healthcare provider will help make sure that you get the documentation you need so that you can get the assistance animal that you need quickly and smoothly. That said, a housing provider might still deny your request for a service animal or assistance animal. So what if that happens? Don't be afraid to be your own advocate. Make sure that you calmly ask why the request was denied. Make sure that you have kept copies or originals of all documentation that you submit to the housing provider. I always recommend that you submit your request by email or in writing so that you can keep copies and there's a paper trail. You do not have to submit your request in writing. It's just I have always found that it is helpful. You also do not have to submit your request on a specific form, and the housing provider may not require specific types of evidence of you. If your documentation meets the requirements set out in the HUD guidance, let the housing provider know this and point them to the HUD guidance document or this webinar. The housing provider may not require you to have your statement notarized or given under penalty of perjury. If they do require either of those things, point them again to the HUD guidance or to this webinar. This may still not be enough, and the housing provider might still deny your request. Don't panic. HUD administers a variety of housing programs in the United States and can direct you or forward your complaint to the proper agency with jurisdiction. Find out if the housing provider participates in any of TDHCA's programs, such as the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, the Home Program, Emergency Solutions Grants, Amy Young Barrier Removal, Bootstrap Loan Program, and so on. You can always look in TDHCA's Vacancy Clearinghouse to see if a property is listed there. If they participate in a TDHCA-administered program, you can file a complaint with us at TDHCA. Also, file a complaint with the Texas Workforce Commission's Civil Rights Division. Texas Workforce Commission is responsible for enforcing the Fair Housing Act in Texas. Did you all want to talk about your complaint process and maybe about conciliation and mediation?
I think our complaint process is pretty much, I want to say it's about the same thing as you guys. I mean, we get, when somebody files a complaint with us, it goes to, first it goes to our intake and they get specific information regarding the case, you know, whether you have evidence or if you have witnesses, and then it goes to, if it's deemed that you have a cause case, then it goes to an investigator, and from there it just has its own process. It really depends on the specific case itself. Sometimes it can go to, there's an option to go to mediation, which is a free service that we provide, and it kind of gets both parties in front of each other so that they can come to a reasonable agreement that everybody is happy with. Once that is said and done, whether you're still in the investigation mode or mediation mode, if you're, once everything settles down, the end result is usually, sometimes there's monetary relief for the complainant, and majority of the time there is always going to be some type of fair housing training for the respondent and all parties involved. And sometimes within the housing industry, that could be the homeowner. Let's say somebody's renting out a home, and that could be the homeowner, and let's say that homeowner is using a rental agency to manage all their, it's a management company, to manage all their tenants. Then it would also include them as well. And Lena, you have anything to add?
Yeah, Thank you. To summarize, the burden of proof still falls on the complainant filing the allegation. And during intake, as Marilyn said, it's a very heavy burden on the complainant to justify an investigation. If there is such, then there is an option where if both parties agree to voluntarily mediate, then that process will occur, which keeps it separate from investigation. The key point here is that if you find yourself in such a situation, I would encourage mediation, primarily for the fact that once it goes into investigation and investigation has begun, it is available to open records. So for property providers, housing providers, this can impact your public image, and just something to keep in mind. We work really hard with both parties to try to keep it out of investigation through mediation, but if mediation fails, then it will go into investigation, and the end result will be determined by the investigator. 9 times out of 10, whether mediation or investigation resolution, there will be training involved.
Great. And just out of my own experience in the 2019 analysis of impediments, we looked at complaint data, fair housing complaint data for the state of Texas. The other thing about mediation is that it is significantly faster than going all the way through investigation and into litigation.
Yes.
Much, much faster.
Yes, and looking at our 2019 data numbers from the Civil Rights Division, 60% of our housing allegations complaints were of reasonable accommodation, and of that 60%, we're seeing a continual rise with the service and emotional support animal. What the number one issue is that the failure to actually have the discussion, i.e. the interactive process. What that technical term means is that the property provider and the tenant are communicating effectively. And that's where we see the biggest denial of reasonable accommodation, as well as an agency's purchasing process that can then impact a reasonable accommodation request within a reasonable amount of time. We've also seen that as a high trend in 2019.
Great. Thank you, guys. So I'm going to put up give you a chance to write down any of this information, and we're going to also take a look at any new questions that have come in that we can answer. Kate, did we have any new questions?
Yeah, we've got a couple of more questions here. There's a few questions that came in that have to do with timing of things. The first one is, when do you have to update the documentation of an assistance animal? Could this be something annually that a property would update within their files?
May I take that on?
Go for it.
This is Elena with the Civil Rights Division. I would encourage you, as a best practice within your policies and procedures as a property provider, as a business, to have that as an annual review for all your tenants, not just for those specific. Again, you want to apply it universally and not individually.
Okay, thank you. And then the next question related to the time frame of this is, what would be a reasonable amount of time to give someone to come up with their paperwork to prove, either the need for the assistance animal or the disability?
Again, this is Elena with the Civil Rights Division. Again, I would go back to your policies and procedures and actually implement develop and implement such a policy, and or B, make sure that you're following your policy, or C, make modifications that better meet your needs. I would encourage you to
Did we lose you, Elena?
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I cut out by accident. Repeat the question to me again. I'm sorry.
Okay, so the timing, what would be a reasonable amount of time to allow a household to come up with work? Mm-hmm.
Yes, as a best practice in your policies, I would give yourself 14 days. That's a really good rule of thumb, best practice. If you're going to set timelines, reasonable timelines, I encourage to make sure that your staff follow through with those and document. A good best practice is to have a response regarding a request to your tenant within 10 to 14 working days, business days, and be adamant about it and be very proactive in those regards. What you don't want to have happen is that then your tenant, you find yourself in a situation where you're just tennis balling the question back and forth for 30, 60, 90 days. That can get you into a lot of litigation trouble.
Okay. Great, thank you for that. We've got another question here about Texas state law and how that might not be in, how it might be in conflict with the federal laws. So we've got a questioner that asks, how does Texas state law, specifically HRC 121.002, impact the assistance animal definition? It says that the state law says that an assistance animal and service animal can only be a dog.
So
Elena, do you have any input?
Yeah, the ADA and the ADAAA are going to be very specific, and a service animal is specifically federally identified as a dog, whereas an emotional support animal can be just about anything, including a peacock and a monkey.
Right. If you think back to the slide with, in fact, I'll just go back to that slide.
Yeah.
With this here. Okay.
Law is going to be substantially equivalent to the federal law. So Texas Fair Housing Law, Chapter 301 is very specific, and it is going to be very similar situated to federal law. Go ahead.
Yeah. So if you think about this here, right, the Fair Housing Act is broader than the Americans with Disabilities Act and is more permissive in terms of the types of animals that are allowed. Service animals are just a subset of assistance animals as defined by the Fair Housing Act. So in that case, right, it doesn't, a service animal, the distinction between a service animal and assistance animal in terms of what type of animal is allowed is immaterial, right, to the Fair Housing Act. If it is Correct. An assistance animal, which could include emotional support animals, service animals, other types of assistance animals, it's not in conflict with, say, the ADA. It's just more permissive than the ADA from the perspective of the tenant. From the perspective of the housing provider, it's more prescriptive in terms of what they cannot disallow or what they must allow.
It's a very good slide.
Yeah, and like Nathan said, all of these slides will be available as soon as possible after the webinar. We'll also post the transcript that's scrolling below. So just give us a little bit of time to get that packaged and ready, and that'll all be posted online. I do have one more question here. Let me just pull this up about documentation for a guest of a tenant who has an assistance animal. Basically, what type of documentation would be needed for a guest of a tenant?
So typically, most housing providers, I immediately think of apartment complexes, typically have that Texas rental lease agreement. And if your agreement states, again, this is going back to your policies and procedures, if your agreement states that guests after so many days have to register with your office, and that would be applied across the board regardless of disability or not. What I would encourage you to do is that if that situation does occur, to note that the guest has a service animal, and you may simply inquire, is this, you may not inquire, I would encourage you to state that your property has this particular policy regarding pets. If you have a no pet policy, then that's one thing, and then that gives that guest an opportunity to divulge if it is a disability or an assistance animal, whether it's service or an emotional support animal. That then allows you as the property owner to be able to ask the follow-up question, well, can you provide me documentation verifying that statement so that I may include it into documentation of your file for your resident? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I would also recommend that a property, excuse me, have in their policies and procedures say, guests are subject to the same policies and procedures as our tenants are, and then that way, you basically would just follow the same procedures that you would for a tenant who has an assistance animal.
Yes,
and then that
exactly.
way, your tenants also know that this applies to guests, and their guests can come with the proper documentation if necessary.
Exactly. Good. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. We've got another question here. This is about a reasonable accommodation in response to a notice to vacate. So if, let's say, a unit receives a notice to vacate, but then they subsequently submit a reasonable accommodation for an assistance animal or a transfer to the first floor. So how should a property or housing provider handle that situation?
So if the unit has received a notice to vacate, but that time frame has not expired, so say it's in many of TDHCA's programs, right, it requires a 30-day notice to vacate. If the tenant is not vacated yet, and that time frame is not up, you have to treat it just like you would any other reasonable accommodation request. It's that would be I should say that would be the safest response. Then, if your property participates in any of TDHCA's programs, I would recommend that you get in touch with TDHCA's compliance staff to get a certain answer about what you should do. That would be my take.
Right, and there are a lot. There are a lot of specific questions coming in that might be, one specific situation, and we will reach out directly to get some more details on some of these questions as well. Go ahead, Elena. My apologies for interrupting.
Oh, no, not a problem. I was just going to state that from the Civil Rights Division perspective, when it comes to allegations in a situation like this, our number one backbone is going to go look at what your policies and procedures state, number one. And if you have that can work, your policies and procedures are a great tool to protect yourself as property providers, but if it's not written well, it can also be very detrimental to you. And what Nathan is saying about the compliance aspect, I would definitely encourage you to do that. And I'm leery of providing specific information regarding this specific example because there's so many variables that are just unknown but I would like to have an opportunity to work with individuals more specific to their situation if possible. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I do want to mention that I don't know for certain what the legal answer is. I'm just saying what I would consider a safe response would be to just follow your reasonable accommodation procedures or your written
Exactly.
procedures, knowing that yeah, it's possible that you're going to have to move somebody to a first floor unit for that 15 days. Um, but that's the safest response.
And on that note, if you do need some assistance with, the language in your policies, if it's a TDHCA property, certainly, reach out to Nathan, myself, or someone in the compliance division, and, we'll do our best to help make sure you've got those policies worded in a way that addresses a lot of these questions.
That's a great resource. Thank you, TDHCA.
Nathan, do we have any more polls or?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, okay, great. I think a lot of the questions that we've got now are pretty specific, and we can follow up directly with each of the individuals and then, post all of our information. Nathan, do you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, I just want to say, thank you all for attending. Let me pull up my notes for this last one. Oh, I don't have any notes for this last slide. Of course I don't. So thank you all for attending. If you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, either us or Texas Workforce Commission, Civil Rights Division. We had their contact information there. The slides from this presentation, along with the handouts and a transcript, are going to be available on the TDHCA website probably by this afternoon. Don't hold me to that. It might be tomorrow, but I'm hoping for this afternoon. So, you can refer back to this at any point in time, and you'll receive a follow-up email in the next day or so that will also have that information for you. It'll give you a link to where the presentation materials will be. And if we did not get to your question, like Kate said, during the webinar, or if it was something that was very situation specific, we will be reaching out to you in the next, as soon as we can, to try to get either more information from you or to get, do the research that we need in order to answer your question. So thank you all for joining us, and we hope you have a good rest of your week.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, TDHCA, all the way around. Greatly appreciate it, and we look forward to working jointly with you with those specific questions as well. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.